In this chapter, we're going to look at the other two macroeconomic statistics that economists care about, unemployment and inflation. In the previous chapter, we had looked at GDP, and we had seen how it tells us a great deal about how production is measured. And again, the other two statistics economists greatly care about would be the inflation and unemployment, which is what we look at here. Okay, I'm just again going to skip the objectives here. And then, just as GDP, we saw was a statistic that was collected by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Here we've got the Bureau of Labor Statistics collecting the data on both the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Unemployment rate kind of giving us a picture of how the labor market looks, and the inflation numbers giving us a clue about how prices in general are changing within the economy. And right now, we know, so as I'm making this lecture here in February of 2022, we know that, especially when it comes to inflation, that inflation is growing quite dramatically. So understanding this statistic then is obviously important. What it also, when we combine our data about inflation with unemployment with GDP, we get even a better sense of how we're doing in terms of the business cycle, and just the general cycle of growth within the economy. So let's start with some definitions first. What does it mean to be employed? To be employed means that the person first is of a legal working age. In this case, we say that even though it differs by states, we're saying that the person has to be at least age 16. That person needs to be working for pay. So unpaid internship does not count here. Um, and the person has to be, um, well, it could be without pay, but it has to be for, you know, your own family. So if your own family is harming you by not paying you, I guess it's your own issue. Um, and then you have to have um, a job of some kind. And you can be not working, but you have to be just temporarily not working. So temporary absence of some kind, like a global pandemic, that would do it for understanding where we're at right now. What does it mean to be unemployed? Some of the same conditions. Obviously, you don't have a job. So then the key condition then becomes that you have to be taking specific actions to try to find work, which would mean if you're not taking actions to find work, then you're not employed because you don't have a job, but you're also not unemployed because you haven't taken those steps to find to find work. So, um, with that said, that person would then be counted as not in the labor force. So someone who just has given up looking for work, that person is counted as not in the labor force. Also counted in this category would be, for instance, someone who is retired, right? The whole notion of being retired is that you're not looking for work anymore. You don't want to work anymore. Um, the not in the labor force may also be a college student, right? Who doesn't have to, um, a fortunate one who doesn't have to have a job at that point. Um, a caregiver within the home for a child. That would be someone who's not in the labor force. So that not in the labor force category can actually be quite large. And so then the labor force itself is going to consist of the employed and the unemployed, and the population is going to consist of the labor force plus not in the labor force. This becomes a little clumsy when we try to look at it this way, so let me try to make this a little bit clearer. So we have our total population, which in the case of the US is 335 million. And then the first thing we do is we create a category called civilian non-institutional population. So civilian non-institutional population consists of the individuals who are not in the military, not in a prison, not in a long-term hospital, and adults. So this would be kids, military, people who are long-term in a hospital or nursing home, people who don't expect to be working or even looking for work. Then within that civilian, so think of this category kind of as a physically able to work. Then we have our labor force and not in labor force. So not in labor force would be college students, perhaps, right? If they just have going to school full time. Retirees who theoretically could work, are physically able to work, but they choose not to. The very rich, I don't know, does a Kardashian work? And the very rich, that kind of thing. Then within our labor force, we have the employed and the unemployed. So that's our way of understanding society as it exists, from our total population of 335 million. In fact, let's do this. Okay, so here we go. Look at this. So here's our civilian non-institutional population. In this case, it looks to be. Oh, these aren't the total numbers. Okay, well, we can't see it there. Yeah, here we go. Civilian non-institutional population. 263 million. Okay, so let's start to fill out some of these numbers here. So we're saying that this is 263, which would then mean if you do 335, sorry, getting my calculator here. 335 minus 263, that gets us 72. Okay, so now we need to find out who's in the labor force versus not in the labor force. So labor force here would be 163 million. Well, that would mean that this is about 100 million. And of that 163 million, employed is 157 million. Which would then, this is then the 6. And let's see, make sure that that's correct. Yep, a little over, but that's just because of all the rounding I've been doing. Okay. Just back out of that. Now, how do we measure the unemployment rate, which would be the thing that you probably hear about quite often, at least in the news? So for the unemployment rate, what we've got there is that it represents the total number of employed over the size of the civilian labor force. So in our case here, with the numbers that we had, that was the 6.5 over 263. If my memory serves me right. Which should get, over 163, not 263. 6.5 divided by 163 gets us approximately a 4% unemployment rate. Let's see if the math works out. There we go, 4% right there. Yeah, and that's pretty close to 100 million, right? 99,516. The numbers are working out. And so then the other part of this is looking at the labor force participation rate. That becomes pretty important because for the labor force participation rate, it gets us a good idea about how much labor we're getting out of everybody. Are the people working or not? And what we can see is, the way that we would calculate this is the total size of the labor force divided by the size of the population. Total size of the labor force divided by the population, which we don't have here. So let's just do it over here. So this would be the total size of the labor force. 163. And our one. So that's our 163. And that's going to be divided by our population. That's not going to be our total population. That's going to be probably our civilian non-institutional population. Which is our 263. or approximately a 62% labor force participation rate. Let's try to see if we can find out if that's true or not. Look at that decline right there. Huge decline because of the pandemic. People just leaving the labor force. Looks like in January of 22, 62.2%. There we go. Proved our math. We are some pretty smart cookies. It's a weird phrase, isn't it? Smart cookies. Okay. But again, I don't want to dismiss. Look at that change there. 63.4 to 60. That's 4% of the labor force. Or sorry, 4% decrease in the ratio of the of the civilian non-institutional population that just left um, the labor force. Either take care of a loved one or just said, I don't want to be in this. Now, we could look at time use things. Certainly, this one's just talking about a recession. We could do the same kind of discussion for how would this look different if we were talking about a global pandemic. That would be another way to look at it. But again, it's up to you if you want to do that. We've already done this. These kinds of calculations. So if you just go back, you can kind of see how to do these kinds of calculations. Now, unemployment does not affect groups equally. In fact, what we see is for a variety of reasons. So I don't want you to think this is just, you know, discrimination or things like that that are just operating there. It's a lot more complicated than that. And we see here that Caucasians have a pretty low unemployment rate here. Men have a low unemployment rate. And as compared to African American men. And that Caucasian women, 3.3%, have a lower unemployment rate compared to African American women. Right? It's almost half that. Even among teenagers, look at that. Among teenagers aged 16 to 19, the unemployment rate there, 12.6%, half. Less than half of what it is for African Americans. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that the labor force is discriminatory. Although I think, the argument can be made that that happens. But that doesn't explain most of this. Then because we actually need to get then into deeper causes of why people are unemployed. For some groups, the large reason becomes one of lack of access to transportation or lack of access to affordable childcare. Those two reasons right there explain a good deal of it. The other thing, although this has become a little bit less important over time, which turns out to be a pretty good thing, was the tendency for employers to ask about criminal history, and that criminal history leading to individuals not getting interviews or not getting jobs. But what we have found is that that's been reduced over time as states have increasingly outlawed that practice, just because of the discriminatory effects it tends to have. Now, what becomes more concerning over time is the fact that if someone is looking for employment for a while, they may end up not looking anymore. And when they stop looking for work, that places them as a discouraged worker. And so, as a discouraged worker, they're not counted as unemployed. They're not counted as unemployed because the one thing we know is that to be counted as unemployed, you have to be looking for work. A discouraged worker has given up looking for work. So they will not be unemployed. They're not going to be part of the civilian labor force. So, in terms of our table, that individual is going to go from unemployed to not in the labor force when they become discouraged. Um, and the discouraged worker effect could just be that conditions are so bad that you don't look for work. That would be a global pandemic again, would be another great example of why a worker might become discouraged. When a lot of the extra payments that went to those who are unemployed, when those payments stopped, individuals probably started looking for work, thus pushing them back to being unemployed and thus being part of the labor force once again, which probably explains that increase, right? Because as the payments decreased, individuals started looking for work. Again, let's skip the economics and practice. So, when we look at individuals and we try to understand how long they're unemployed, one of the troubling things that we see is that the length of time of unemployment has increased. Um, that over the past 50 years, it's a bit more than doubled. Now, why is that? Two things. The one thing could be is that individuals are becoming unemployed and they actually have to they have to be trained for an entirely new profession. So if someone used to be, um, I don't know, um, a grocery store clerk, and then more people started getting their groceries, delivered to them. So as they got delivered to them, the grocery store clerk was no longer needed. Then they may need to be retrained to be a carpenter or whatnot, and that training process takes time, and that could explain this. The other way that it could be explained is by virtue of the fact that um, unemployment benefits, they're not generous, but they may cause a person to wait to look for work until those unemployment benefits almost run out. Again, let's not worry about economics and practice. So the the government and even other bodies within the government do spend a great deal of time looking at why people are unemployed. And based on why people are unemployed, then they have different levels of concern. So there's three kinds of unemployment: frictional, structural, and cyclical. And depending on the kind of unemployment you have, um, the government would have to have a different kind of policy. Um, to try to help an individual um, get out of that unemployment. So let's look at the definition of each of these. So for frictional unemployment, this is just the natural way that a market works, where an individual is just going to have to find a new job. If I lost, so I'm an academic, obviously, there is a season to someone getting an academic job, which would be you can only really get an academic job when right before a semester starts. If I lost my job in the middle of a semester, I kind of have to wait. Who's going to hire me in the middle of a semester? Unless someone's like dying or something, like dead, and they can't teach your class anymore, there's no reason why anyone's going to hire me. So I'm probably going to be frictionally unemployed until the start of the next semester. The government, generally speaking, isn't going to get too concerned about frictional unemployment. It's just a natural friction in the labor force. Structural unemployment, however, is a bit more concerning. And the reason why it's more concerning is because um, it highlights the fact that your skill set is no longer valued. So it's going to take a lot of time for you to retrain to have a new kind of job. So structural unemployment would mean that the government's going to need to provide a lot of retraining and you're going to be unemployed for a long period of time. If we add up the frictional and the structural unemployment, that is what equals the natural rate of unemployment. So do not think that the natural rate of employment is zero. There's always going to be some unemployment in an economy based on the natural frictions of a market or the fact that people lose their jobs because their skill set is no longer needed. We add on to the natural rate of unemployment the cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is when you lose your job based on the performance of the economy. Right? So, as we would expect during a recession, people lose their jobs. And so that would add to the unemployment rate. Or, sorry, it would add to the unemployment levels. During a really good economic time, we may even expect that like people who typically would not have a job might be convinced to start working because the money is so good. And if that's the case, then the actual unemployment rate could actually be less um, than the natural. So the idea here, if we just write this out here, is that we have a measured unemployment rate, which is the number of unemployed over the size of the civilian labor force. We just saw that calculation before, right? Now, what we're saying is that we can compare the measured unemployment to the natural unemployment. Which is the frictional plus the structural. And that there may be a difference between this number and this number, with that difference being the cyclical. The natural unemployment rate in the US is generally thought to be somewhere between 4 to 5%. So any deviation of that 4 to 5% rate is going to be cyclical unemployment. Now, this may seem like I don't even need to talk about this, but we should. And the question would be is why does it why do we care? Does it matter that individuals are unemployed? And it does. Um, individuals are greatly affected by not having work. It obviously hurts an individual's self esteem. They lose certain skills by being out of the labor force. And, we don't want um, an individual who's unemployed basically means that the economy is less efficient. And we don't want that. So, to fix that, the government, really starting after during the Great Depression, and certainly much more after the Great Depression, got much more involved in trying to reduce the unemployment rate. Okay, so now the other side of this is thinking about prices. So, when thinking about prices, the way that we measure prices is with something um, called the Consumer Price Index or CPI. And what the CPI represents is a basically a basket of goods that that's fixed in that is the goods within that basket are the same month after month after month. And what changes is the price of those same goods month after month after month. So the quantities are static over time. It's the prices that are allowed to adjust. Consumer price indexes means that we're looking at the goods that consumers typically buy. The other side of that would be that we could look at what firms buy. So we could look at something called the producer price index, and that would give us an idea of the prices faced by producers and how those have changed over time. Now, what is in the consumer price index? Um, Within the consumer price index, as you can see here, a good deal of it is housing. So, if a good deal of it is housing, certainly we've seen with rising house prices. I'm not sure we should be too concerned about the inflation numbers because part of it could just be the fact that housing prices are rising so much. Is it all the other stuff that's rising as well? Well, in this current moment of inflation, unfortunately, a lot of what we're seeing is actually um, increases in the prices of all those other things. Um, so that's where things get a bit more concerning. And so, um, again, what the Consumer Price Index does is it looks at these items. It looks at how it keeps the quantity of the good constant over time, and it just looks at how the price is changing over time, um, and using that as a way to understand changes in prices. And so, as the I in index stands for, or the I in CPI stands for index, and what that's telling us is it's giving us an idea of. Sorry, I'm also looking at something at the same time. What that's telling us is how much the things cost in a base year, and then we index it to other years. So, um, what we're seeing here is that the base year is going to be where the CPI number is 100. Here we can see that it's approximately 1984, 1983 to 1984, where it's about 100, the index number. Now, these numbers themselves don't mean much, but what we do is we calculate the percentage change in the index numbers to tell us what the inflation number is. So what we can see here, for instance, is that when it went from 103.9 to 107.6, that was about a 3.6% increase in the CPI. So prices had increased that year about 3.6%. There are times where you see the number being quite high, 11%, 13%. Some of the older students in this class, some of you will remember it being that high. And you get rare instances where it's actually negative. That's actually not a good thing. You don't want prices going down. There's a variety of reasons of why you don't want that, but it's generally pretty destructive to an economy to have it decreasing. And what that does for us is it again allows us to um, get an idea of how prices are changing over time. And we can do this over a multiple year time period, or we can just do it year over year. Why we would do it year over year would be so that we could, for instance, payments for things like Social Security, for instance, could go up by a certain amount um, every year. Now, inflation, what's bad about it is that it creates uncertainty. That uncertainty it creates is um, you're not sure exactly when to purchase the good because you don't know what the price is going to be in the future. It's also bad because it may mean that my income level, which my wage rate and whatnot that hasn't changed, um, I'm now buying these goods that are becoming much more expensive, and so my wages have less purchasing power. Now, if my wage goes up, which is kind of what this slide then is kind of talking about, if my wage goes up at the same time as prices are going up, I may not really be affected. So now you're really talking about the effectiveness of the labor market. Is the labor market effective um, in ensuring that wages are increasing enough to compensate individuals? So, what's the power of workers? The one more concerning part about inflation is that it does cause almost arbitrary redistributions of wealth and income. And it does this when the inflation is unanticipated. So, as an example of this, um, I got my um, I got my mortgage, 30-year mortgage, fixed rate mortgage, in October of 2020, when the inflation rate was quite low. But unexpectedly, we now are in 2022, and the inflation rate is quite high, which has worked well for me as a borrower, but not good for the individuals who saved at the bank and provided the money that I then borrowed. And the reason why is because now it's going to be easier to pay back my loan because my interest rate is really, really low. But I'm paying it back with dollars like today dollars. And today dollars are less valuable than they were 2 years ago. because of this inflation. And so it's going to be easier for me to pay back the money. Those who saved their money were promised an interest rate over a period of time, and now it's going to be easier for the bank to pay them off because, again, the money is less valuable. So, unfairly, unexpectedly, I benefited as a borrower, and the savers unexpectedly lost. Sucks, basically. So, the real interest rate is then going to be a reflection of kind of what I was just talking about here, which would be I borrowed and I was told what the nominal interest rate was. So, for instance, for my mortgage, I got my mortgage at 2.8%. That consists of two components: a real interest rate plus inflation. Well, if inflation right now is, I don't know, let's say 6%, then this real inflation rate is going to have to be negative for it to equal 2.8%. What the real inflation rate is a measure of how much that purchasing power had really changed. Or, sorry, not how much the purchasing power changed, but how much um, um, how much the reward was going to be for taking that risk to lend money out. And it turns out that the bank lost on that bet because they're basically, I mean, there's a chance maybe I won't pay back my mortgage. And if I don't, or because that risk exists, the bank um, isn't collecting anything for having taken on that risk. In fact, they're paying me because that real interest rate is negative. Okay, so um, the other problem with inflation is kind of what we could call menu costs. It's kind of an old-fashioned term when menus were printed with prices on them, but there's certain administrative costs and inefficiencies that come from um, doing this. There's actually a really cool Wall Street Journal article from today. Let me try to find it really fast here. Sorry, I was just trying to look at this for this, and I don't see it. Just do a search term here. Well, I can't find it, and I'm not gonna keep looking. There was a Wall Street Journal article, I promise you, that was talking about how difficult it was to, um, or how costly it was for companies to alter their prices, and that's what this is getting at here. That there are costs to having to raise prices, and the more inflation there is, the higher these costs would be. Again, let's not worry about that. So, as I had said, we saw that 1 year where there was some deflation, where the prices went down. Those are generally very bad because what deflation represents Because it's really difficult to lower someone's wage, um, because of deflation, right? When there's inflation, when prices are going up, it's a little easier to raise wages. People are happy about that. But if you're lowering um, prices, if prices are falling, then it's a little bit more difficult um, to do that change. People are going to be less receptive to that. And then also the things are opposite. So when there's deflation, um, you've also got the problem with those who get like let's say a fixed payment from the government, or those who are getting a pension. Um, those individuals are going to end up gaining more. The purchasing power of their benefit is going to go up, which, yes, good for them, but bad for the government that's got to pay those promises out. And we don't necessarily, um, in that kind of time, that kind of circumstance, we don't want to, we don't want the um, government to be placed in that kind of position and have to make that kind of expenditure. So when we put that, when we put both of these things all together, that leads us to the last part of this chapter, where we're going to talk about long run growth. The idea here is that economists have always, um, since Adam Smith, so kind of since the beginning of modern macro or modern economics, um, have had to try to think about how an economy can grow over time. How do you get workers to produce more stuff? That would be our productivity growth. Is how do you get the overall output, the real GDP within the economy to grow? Um, and so we can see here, if we look at productivity growth, it has generally um, increased in the United States, with a few little differences, right? So um, we can see some kind of slight productivity slowdowns in output per worker, um, and then being at a level that's lower than this long term trend line here. What makes a worker productive is good education, good access to technology and capital. Um, and so if those things suffer, then productivity suffers. So, based on that, what explains the fact that this dashed line, which is the output per worker, why is it going down? And it seems to kind of start in the 1980s. Well, part of the reason why economists believe that is because look at the change here, right? So you had a slope that was going up at this, and then it falls, and the slope changes in the 1980s. So maybe one reason why productivity slowed down in the United States is because capital per worker investments slowed down in the United States. And what that would mean is that economic growth in the United States as a whole slowed down as well.